In the first of these three programmes, we saw how Britain's railways had played a vital role in the early years of the war effort, carrying millions of children to safer areas during the mass evacuations, transporting the men and equipment of the British Expeditionary Force to the Channel ports, and bringing the survivors home safely after the fall of France to Nazi German forces. We also saw how the railways suffered widespread damage from German air raids during the Blitz between September 1940 and May 1941. When Britain was threatened with invasion in the early years of the war, 13 of these armoured trains were constructed for coastal defence and stationed around the country. They consisted of former Great Eastern Railway F4 class tank engines, flanked by 2 low-sided wagons and 2 modified LMS coal wagons, fitted with 1/4-inch steel plate for protection. They carried a crew of 26, including gunners, wireless operators and the loco crew. These trains were typically armed with 2 6-pounder guns. From 1942, the Home Guard took over operation of these trains from the Polish soldiers who had previously manned them.
These are just a few samples of the defence tactics of Britain against the promised invasion. Number 1, the defence of a railway station. It might be any station. The great point is that any station will have its defenders, either from the army or the Home Guard or both. The attack might come at any time, perhaps with very little warning. But as the planes roar overhead, the infantry take up positions of concealment from which to deal with all comers. Through a cloud of smoke come tanks, backed up by infantry. But the defense have been well hidden, and it's the paratroops who get the surprise. As a last effort, the paratroops attempt to take the signal box, but they're foiled again. If Hitler does try invasion, his Nazis will be desperate men. But they'll be desperately scared men, too, because they'll know there's no retreat. It's up to us to put them out of their misery, and do it quick.
This film from the LMS shows the extensive work involved in camouflaging their power station at Stonebridge Park in North London. A scale model of the finished item was provided for the painters to work from. The camouflage was designed to make the power station look like a cloudy version of the sports fields and houses to the north of the power station when viewed by the crew of an enemy bomber at night. The size of the houses painted onto the buildings was also exaggerated as a method of further confusing the air crews as to their height and distance from the target. Supplying electricity at 630 volts DC, the power station at Stonebridge Park had originally been built by the London and North Western Railway for the Euston to Watford electrification, which was later expanded to their suburban services from Willesden Junction to Earl's Court and from Richmond to Broad Street. The power station was demolished in the 1960s and is now the site of the main depot for Bakerloo Line underground trains. At an unrecorded location on the LMS, possibly in the Bedfordshire area, a trainload of the 3rd Parachute Battalion's Bren gun carriers is offloaded from a train. Officially titled Universal Carriers, these fast, light armoured tracked vehicles from Vickers Armstrong were designed to carry personnel and equipment defended by small arms fire, specifically the Bren light machine gun. Hence they became popularly known as Bren gun carriers. Over 57,000 were built in this country during World War II by companies including Aveling Barford, Sentinel and Wolseley Motors, and were the most widely used of all armoured fighting vehicles during the conflict. July 1941, at another unrecorded location on the LMS, Valentine tanks from the 6th Armoured Division are loaded onto a train, taking them off on manoeuvres. To run the tanks from ground level onto the flat wagons, a specially designed ramp wagon was used. This four-wheeled wagon had one axle mounted in a detachable subframe, normally locked in position for running. A central jack raised the main body of the wagon clear of the detachable axle, which could then be run clear. The deck was then lowered until the buffer beam rested on the track rails, thus providing a ramp up to the deck of the nearest war flat. These particular tanks are from the 110th Royal Armoured Corps, 5th Battalion Border Regiment. More than 8,000 of these Mark III Valentine tanks were built during the Second World War, accounting for approximately a quarter of wartime British tank production. Hauling the train was LMS 4F class, number 3910, based at Bedford Shed. The tanks are loaded onto war flats, which had a deck length of 40 feet and a carrying capacity of between 40 and 50 tons, depending on the distribution of weight. In this instance, 2 Valentines could be loaded onto each wagon. The same train of tanks is seen again arriving at its destination. Designed by Leslie Little of Vickers Armstrong, the Valentine tank came to be well liked by its crews as it was easy to drive and, more importantly, was extremely reliable, something that couldn't be said for other British tanks of the period. Along with Vickers, the Valentines were also constructed in this country by 2 companies renowned for building railway vehicles, Metropolitan Camel and the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. Valentine tanks were produced in 11 different marks. The many variants included riveted and welded construction, petrol and diesel power plants, and a progressive increase in armament. Their first combat action came during Operation Crusader in the North African desert in late 1941, which successfully relieved the siege of Tobruk and was the first victory over the German army by British-led forces in the Second World War. Arriving at what is believed to be Harpenden Central Station on the LMS is a former London and North Western Railway G2A class 080, hauling a trainload of A22 Churchill tanks. Comprising similar rolling stock to the previous film, the ramp wagon can be seen coupled behind the two vans, followed by 9 Churchill tanks on wharf flats. Due to the heavier weight of these tanks at over 38 tons, they were restricted to 1 tank per flat wagon. The Churchill tank was designed and built at a time when Britain was at its darkest hour in the war. With the army down to its last 100 tanks and the possibility of a German invasion, the tank was rushed into service without the usual development and testing of prototypes. Designed and produced by Vauxhall Motors in Luton, the first Churchill model, the Mark I, was ready by June 1941 and entered large-scale production soon afterwards. Early vehicles were beset with numerous problems and mechanical difficulties. The most critical of these was the reliability of the tank's engine. Another issue was its weak armament. Major improvements were made to the tanks before they could enter service. Their first operational use was in the 1942 Dieppe landings. Later variants saw the Churchill fitted with more powerful weapons and better armour. Despite its early defects, the Churchill evolved into one of the key British tanks of the war. One of the Southern Railway's Merchant Navy class Streamline Pacifics is seen on an express passenger train near Eastleigh. The prototype Merchant Navy had been completed in February 1941, and the naming ceremony for the second prototype, Union Castle, was filmed at Victoria Station on Friday the 4th of July 1941, construction work on the locomotive having been completed several weeks before at Eastleigh Works. Representing the Union Castle Mail Steamship Company was Robertson F. Gibb, a director and former chairman of the shipping line, accompanied by the chairman of the Southern Railway, Robert Holland Martin, along with the Southern's general manager, Eustace Missenden. remaining 8 locomotives in the initial batch of 10 merchant navies to be constructed were completed between September 1941 and July 1942. The first of these, number 21C3 Royal Mail, had its naming ceremony at Waterloo Station on Friday the 24th of October 1941. Robert Holland Martin and Eustace Bissenden were again in attendance. Representing the Royal Mail Lines Limited was the company's chairman, Lord Essendon. Some unusual scenes were witnessed at New Haven Harbour Station on the 4th of October 1941, as plans for the exchange of around 100 sick and seriously wounded German prisoners of war collapsed at the last minute. The men are filmed here disembarking from the hospital ships which had been due to carry them across the Channel. They were instead being returned to their hospitals and POW camps. The original negotiations between the German and British governments through the American embassy had agreed that Germany would repatriate some 1,200 wounded British servicemen in exchange for a smaller number of Germans. However, the day before the exchange was due to take place, a message was received from the German government stating that they were now prepared only to agree to a limited exchange on a one-for-one basis. It was this last-moment attempt to completely overthrow the previous agreement that prompted the British government to cancel the sailing of the ships. The prisoners' train departs, hauled by former London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, H1 Class 442, number 2401 Peveril Point. October 1941, and tests are underway on the Southern Railway at Long Hedge in Battersea on the effectiveness of steel anti-tank hairpins. Under the scrutiny of the British Army, the tests were carried out with a Matilda II infantry tank. The hairpins also proved quite effective against railway wagons as well. Designed to obstruct the free movement of enemy armoured vehicles, the tank traps seen here were essentially the same as those used on roads at strategic locations around the country. Prepared sockets, about 6 inches square, were placed into the ground, into which the angled steel sections could be slotted as required in the event of an invasion. The Matilda tanks had served from the start of the war in the Battle of France, and by 1942 was being declared obsolete. However, due to its usefulness in the Far East and the large numbers that were being sent to Russia, the Matilda was still in production in 1943. Along with the LMS, They were constructed by several companies more famous for building railway locomotives, including the Vulcan Foundry, Ruston and Hornsby, and the North British Locomotive Company. Filmed mid-April 1942, the threat of a German land invasion of England must still have been something that the Southern Railway were considering, as permanent way engineers are filmed at Dorking in Surrey, installing a number of the hairpin tank traps, a seemingly laborious and expensive process. Precast concrete sections were used to provide the foundations of the tank traps, and these are seen here being swung into place. Manufactured at the Southern Railway's reinforced concrete works at Exmouth Junction in Exeter, the sections came ready-made with the sockets to take the steel hairpins. The railway lines between Dorking and Leatherhead would have been of strategic importance for the German army if they did launch an invasion, as they run through the Mole Gap, one of the few natural breaches in the North Downs, a ridge of chalk hills that stretch from Farnham in Surrey to the White Cliffs of Dover. Throughout the war, the manufacturing capacity of Britain's railway works was turned towards the war efforts along with their freight network. One of the railway builders' less successful projects was the Covenanter cruiser tank, designed by the LMS and built at their Crewe works. It fulfilled a very important training role in the UK, but was never used in combat and was declared obsolete in 1943. These are naval mines with their attached sinker mechanisms being prepared for onward transportation by train from the Wolseley Motor Company's factory in Oxford. Following collection by the LMS, these anti-shipping mines would be taken to the Royal Navy's Ordnance Depot near Stirling in central Scotland. There they would be filled with a charge of high explosive, usually amatol, a mixture of TNT and ammonium nitrate. A diesel shunter at the Royal Ordnance Factory in Nottingham prepares a trainload of naval guns for collection by the LMS. Considerable effort had been expended in turning the Nottingham facility into a modern gun factory and employed up to 14,000 people during the war. Also produced here were anti-aircraft weapons such as the Bofors gun, along with a variety of artillery and vehicle-mounted guns. LMS Class 2PD tank engine number 2098 from Nottingham Shed hauls the load away from the ordnance factory. Whilst iron ore production in Great Britain during World War II amounted to around 120 million tonnes, the demand for steel and other metals was enormous. Here, scrap metal is collected from a ship at the docks and loaded onto a train. From here, it would have been taken away to the steelworks for recycling to aid the war effort. Housewives around the country were also urged to help the government salvage drive by collecting their tins and old pots and pans, along with things such as old Wellingtons, which would be melted down and turned into tyres for aircraft and lorries, meat bones, which were boiled down to make glue, and paper, which was recycled into shell cups for the ammunition factories. Horse-drawn wagons arrive at Heckmanwick station on the line from Mirfield to Bradford in Yorkshire, with a trainload of barbed wire manufactured by a local company. This all had to be manually transferred into the waiting railway wagons for onward delivery. These are gas cylinders for barrage balloons being prepared at the factory for delivery by train. 30 of these cylinders were loaded onto a four-wheeled trailer which was supplied with each barrage balloon. The 30 cylinders held enough hydrogen for the initial filling of the balloon. The skills of the LMS carriage builders was put to good use as part of the war effort. These are wooden propellers for bombers being sent off from the railway works. Here a consignment of bombs is carefully offloaded from an LMS road delivery lorry onto railway wagons. This delivery by the LMS is a truckload of TNT to be delivered to the customer by road. Fortunately, unlike more sensitive high explosives such as nitroglycerin, TNT is insensitive to shock and friction, making it easy to transport under conditions such as this. Also being transported by rail are these artillery shells, which require a somewhat tedious loading procedure. These are much larger naval shells which need craning onto railway wagons. Along with the shells that they fired, the railway companies also delivered the gun barrels from the steelworks to the shipyards. This is the English Steel Corporation's foundry in Sheffield, where a newly completed gun barrel is ready for dispatch by train. A massive project undertaken by the Southern Railway towards the end of 1941 was the manufacture of 1,000 goods wagons for supply to Russia. This number of vehicles would normally have been 1 year's peacetime output. However, the Southern completed the job in just 10 weeks. The wagons were to be supplied flat-packed and ready to be assembled in Russia. Germany had invaded Russia on the 22nd of June 1941. The loss of mining and industrial centres to the Germans in the Western Soviet Union necessitated the speedy construction of new railways which would play a vital role transporting military personnel, equipment and freight to the front lines, and often evacuating entire factories and towns from European Russia to the Ural region and Siberia. At this time, Britain was supplying munitions and other war materials to Russia on a lend-lease basis without monetary limit. One train of wagon parts was filmed on the 5th of November 1941, hauled by Southern Railway Class W 264 tank number 1914. To mark the completion of the last wagon, guest of honour Harry Llewellyn presided over a special ceremony held at Ashford on the 10th of November 1941. Llewellyn had achieved some success as a show jumping champion during the 1930s and competed in the Grand National, coming second in 1936 to the Great Reynoldstown. As the war progressed, staff shortages worsened as more and more men were called up to fight, and the only option open to the railways was the employment of women. The use of female staff was slow at first, and there was considerable opposition amongst older railwaymen. The situation changed dramatically at the end of 1941, when the introduction of the National Service Act No. 2 made the conscription of women legal.
Now, Miss Sutton, what do you think of this conscription scheme?
Well, I think it's a very good idea. It shows that the women of this country are doing their bit as well as the men.
And you, Miss Clark?
Well, I think the sooner we all pull together in this thing, the sooner it will be over. I myself would like to go in the services because it's the uniform that appeals.
Uh-huh.
At first, only single women aged 20 to 30 were called up, but by mid-1943, almost 90% of single women and 80% of married women were employed in essential work for the war effort.
All through the war, through blitz and blackout, in snow and sunshine, the wheels of transport have been kept rolling. All the work of all our factories would stop if transport ceased, and playing their part in the transport scheme there have been the British Railways. Keeping the rolling stock rolling is a man-sized job, but there are women doing it. Sparks of industry fly from the slim fingers of women. Total war hits out no less roughly at women, and women have a right to hit back. In the Boer War, great-grandmama was doing fancy embroidery. Her great-granddaughter does her fancy work in steel. She used to be a shop assistant, but now she works at the forge to keep the wheels of the rolling stock rolling. Forges, lathes, and radial drills. The hands that used to make buttonholes can now punch holes in steel to keep the wheels rolling. Even on the permanent way, strapping women do a back-breaking job and like it. You'll see them engaged in every kind of work, like these girls who work for the Southern Railway. And when you raise your hat to them, it really does mean something. You see them working on concrete. You see them reinforcing. You see them doing a porter's job, and there's no need to hand them your bag and then offer to carry it yourself. They've taken over a man's job and they do it without any fuss. So next time you travel, think of the women behind the scenes who keep the rolling stock rolling.
A ladder on the shoulder's worth two in the stocking, say the girls of Gainsborough. So they step into the breach and the breeches to paint the bridge over the River Trent. All the men painters are in the forces and, well, a miss is as good as a male. They wear a special safety harness when they're working, but that alone isn't what makes them stick to their post. It's the knowledge that they're doing a good wartime job well. Yes, that's the River Trent down there, but not quite so far down is the safety hook. Trust a woman to see that a new coat is a good coat, and paint's no exception.
The passenger loadings of trains on the 23rd and 24th of December 1941 were filmed for internal use by the management of the Great Western Railway. Prompted by the enormous amount of people that had crowded onto the many additional trains run by the railway companies over the previous August bank holiday, the government had ordered that no additional services would be operated over the Christmas period. This was an attempt to reduce what the government saw as needless travel by members of the public in times of war. Only normally scheduled trains would be run. Being shot for record purposes, this film, of course, concentrates more on the passenger flow than the steam locomotives, although there are some glimpses of Great Western kings and castles, and it does provide an excellent portrait of the hustle and bustle at the 5 mainline stations the cameras visited over those busy couple of days. Filmed at the Southern Railway's docks at Southampton on the 16th of February 1942, Lend-Lease cargoes from America are unloaded from a ship, the SS Pandorian, which had crossed the Atlantic as part of convoy number HX-172. Under the Lease-Lend program, which had begun in March 1941, the United States of America supplied Britain with more than $31 billion of war materials. The equivalent to that today would be well over $400 billion. With no film unit of their own during World War II, material shot on the LNER is somewhat rare, so it's interesting to see these scenes filmed at one of the LNER's freight marshalling yards on the 2nd of March 1942. This is one of the LNER's 04 class 280s. Reversing onto its train is number 4643, a Grizzly-designed K2 class 260 goods engine. With oil having to be saved for the most essential uses, primarily military, almost all medium and long-distance commercial and private transport by road had ceased. The railways had to take up the traffic instead. All of Britain's 1.25 million railway freight vehicles, both railway company owned and privately owned, had been pooled during the war, and to ensure the best distribution of wagons of various sorts wherever they were needed, a central wagon control had been established. By 1943, Britain's railways were handling around 3 million loaded wagons each month. Filmed in March 1942 at Hassocks in West Sussex on the Brighton Main Line is the prototype of the Southern Railway's new third rail electric locomotives, number CC1. Built at Ashford Works, the engine was intended for use on both express passenger and goods trains. CC1 is seen again arriving at Brighton. The locomotive was a collaboration between the Southern's chief mechanical engineer Oliver Bullitt and Alfred Rayworth, the chief electrical engineer. Construction of CC1 and a second prototype, CC2, built in 1945, was exempted from the wartime restrictions on building new types of locomotives because of promised savings in labour and fuel costs over steam engines. CC1 soon proved its worth. The locomotive's 6 traction motors provided 1,470 horsepower, allowing it to handle 1,000-ton freight trains with ease. The task of repairing structures on the railways damaged during the Blitz could take a considerable amount of time to complete. In the first of these programmes, we saw the destruction caused to Southwark Street Bridge near Blackfriars Junction during an air raid on the 19th of April 1941. The cameras returned to the site on the 27th of June 1941 to record the temporary work which had been undertaken. Where possible, the sections of the bridge which were still usable had been lifted back into position, while temporary trestling had been erected to enable the operation of 4 running lines. This is the bridge from track level, looking south towards Elephant and Castle. The damage to nearby buildings from the bombing is still evident. Looking in the opposite direction in this excellent panoramic shot, we see the damaged Blackfriars Goods Station, originally the terminus of the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, beyond which is Blackfriars Bridge running over the River Thames. In the background is St Paul's Cathedral, an iconic sight to many in the East End of London, as all through the darkest days of the Blitz, it escaped serious damage while the city around it was devastated. The full reconstruction of Southwark Street Bridge required 1,000 tons of steel. This could take some time to procure during the war, as precedence was given to steel for the production of munitions. Filmed on the 20th of April 1942, a year after the bridge was damaged in the air raid, new girders for Southwark Street are finally en route, seen here passing through Loughborough Junction near Brixton in South London. "20 girders, each of them 115 feet long and weighing 53 tons, were transported by rail to the site using Lowe's single-ended wagons named pollens, which were used for exceptionally long items such as these. One pollen with a capacity of 30 tons supported each end of the girders on their journey from the steelworks in the north. The new girders are lifted into place by 2 of the Southern Railway's Ransom's and Rapier 45-ton steam cranes. Army horses and mules, along with wagons and artillery guns from the nearby barracks, arrive at Weedon Railway Station in Northamptonshire on the 22nd of April 1942. Horses were used by many nations during World War II, principally for hauling troops, artillery and materials. Germany, for example, was heavily dependent on horse-drawn transportation, as it was relatively lacking in natural oil resources. Infantry and horse-drawn artillery formed the bulk of the German army throughout the war, with only 1/5 of the army belonging to mobile panzer and mechanized divisions. For the British Army, whilst the majority of the traditional cavalry units were now mechanized, horses played an important role in theatres of war where the terrain made the use of motorized vehicles impossible. These included locations such as Sicily and mainland Italy, Palestine and Burma. One class of locomotives which did sterling work throughout the war for the LNER were the versatile and powerful V2s, designed by Nigel Gresley and introduced in 1936. Classmate number 4868, built in 1940 and based at Peterborough Shed, was filmed on the 16th of June 1942. These mixed traffic engines performed some remarkable feats of haulage during wartime, with trains of over 20 carriages loaded to 700 tons, proving well within their abilities. Steam power of a somewhat different variety was filmed by the Southern Railway Film Unit at Stewart's Lane Depot in June 1942. The engine is one of 9 former London, Brighton and South Coast Railway D1 class tank engines, which were equipped during the early 1940s with water pumps and firefighting equipment. These were stationed at the major motive power depots in London to deal with incendiary bomb attacks. The addition of a steam-powered pump allowed 2 hoses for the use of fighting fires in the vicinity of the running lines. Here, the water is being drawn directly from the mains, which could be problematic, as often during air raids, water supplies were lost due to bombs fracturing the mains pipes. Number 2215 was built in 1875 and was named Stockwell. Designed by William Stroudley, these D1s were intended for heavier tasks than could be undertaken by his A1 class Terriers, and for many years were the mainstay of LBSCR outer suburban services. alternative source of water for these firefighting engines would be the tenders of steam locomotives, which normally held around 4,000 gallons. Another of the modified D1 class engines was filmed at Nine Elms Shed, taking water from the 8-wheeled tender of a former London and South Western Railway paddle box 460 locomotive. This D1 was built in 1886 and carried the name Keema. This is a film of a gas attack clean-up exercise shot at an unrecorded loco depot on the LMS. The use of poison gas in World War II was a very real fear. It had been used in World War I in France with devastating effect by both the Germans and the British, and many expected that it would be used again by the Germans against civilian targets in this country. Along with chlorine and phosgene, mustard gas had been widely used by the Germans in World War I and was crude but effective. Heavier than air, it settled to the ground as an oily liquid. Such was the polluting nature of mustard gas that once in the soil, or as here, onto steam locos and rolling stock, it remained active for several days, weeks, or even months, depending on the weather conditions. Hence the extensive cleansing procedures undertaken here. Amongst the locomotives seen in this sequence are a selection of LMS 8F and 4F class engines.
Carry your gas mask, always, at all times, in all places. Have it at hand, night and day. Make especially sure that it is in good order and repair. Get thoroughly accustomed to wearing it. See that every member of your household does all these things.
A more spectacular poison gas attack exercise was staged by the LMS on an abandoned line in Scotland. Before the grouping in 1923, the Darvel to Strathaven Railway had been jointly operated under a curious arrangement by the Glasgow and South Western Railway and the Caledonian Railway, whereby the two companies ran the line for 6 months each every year. The route was never successful and had been closed by the LMS in 1939. The locomotive derailed in this exercise was redundant former Caledonian Railway Dunalister class, number 14330. These mixed-traffic 2P class engines dated to 1896 and were designed by John F. McIntosh for the Caledonian. In attendance for re-railing the locomotive is the LMS's Motherwell breakdown crane. An example of the support for Britain's railway workers from amongst the fraternity of railway trade unions in other Allied nations is seen here on the LMS at what could possibly be a bomb-damaged Willesden shed in North London. A presentation ceremony takes place to mark the delivery of a mobile trailer kitchen. This was supplied to the workers courtesy of fundraising efforts in Canada by the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, North America's oldest rail labor union, founded in 1863 in Marshall, Michigan. In honor of the gift from Canada, the ceremony was held against a backdrop of LMS Jubilee class locomotive named Ontario. Filmed at Haywards Heath on the 9th of August 1942 was a train of Canadian Ram cruiser tanks en route to Crowborough in East Sussex. Due to the loss of the majority of the United Kingdom's tank force in France at the start of the war, it was necessary, if Canada was to equip with tanks, to manufacture locally. The Ram tanks were built by the Montreal Locomotive Works, based on the design of the US M3 medium tank. Due to standardization on the American Sherman tank for frontline units, it was used exclusively for training purposes and was never used in combat. The Canadian engineers ran into many challenges when developing the tank, as Canada had never produced a tank before. The tanks are unloaded from the train at Crowborough. During World War II, Canadian troops attached to the 4th Armoured Division were based at nearby Warren Camp and West Camp. Hauled by a Southern Railway U-Class 260, more armour was filmed on the 21st of August 1942 as a trainload of Bren gun carriers leaves Shorncliffe in Kent on the outskirts of Folkestone, site of a large army barracks.
This war, more than any other in the history of mankind, is a war of transport. Troops must be carried to their positions to guard Britain and to attack from Britain. And all the weapons of war must be transported with them. The factories which make these weapons must be fed with raw materials and supplied with workers. Keep the lines clear for waging war. Remember, every time you ride in a train, you're using coal that's needed to make the machines of war. Every time you ride in a bus, you're using petrol that's needed to drive these machines. You may not be very big or very heavy, and you may not be going more than a 3-halfpenny ride, but every little counts. So save your fare and save our fuel. And march to victory with the troops.
This sequence features several pieces of film shot for the LMS depicting the transportation of troops on exercise and manoeuvres, the locations of which, like much of the LMS film included in this programme, was not recorded. These military specials were organised by close liaison between the mainline railways and Movement Control, a department of the War Office under the command of the Quartermaster General, which exercised centralised control of the shipment of equipment and supplies, along with the movement of troops around the country. Liaison at a local level between the railways and the military was maintained by railway traffic officers, located with their staffs at main stations. Many of these troop trains were run at short notice. Notification was received at the railway company's traffic headquarters, and a detailed path for the running of the train was made. This information was then issued in special train notices, which were distributed to control officers, station masters and signalmen along the route. Only a very few railway operating officials would know the true character of these trains and their destinations. To the majority of the staff concerned with their running, they would be just one of hundreds of special trains passing along the local railway tracks every day. Information such as which unit the troops belonged to would be kept secret. These scenes were filmed at Prestatyn in North Wales. The men would have been travelling to the Royal Corps of Signal's No. 2 training centre, located nearby in a requisitioned holiday camp. A large contingent of French troops are seen boarding a train at a country station somewhere on the LMS. Initial support for de Gaulle's Free French Army had been minimal. Of the tens of thousands of French soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk in June 1940, only about 3,000 had chosen to remain here and continue the fight against the Germans. The rest had asked to be repatriated. During 1942 and 43, as the tide of war began to turn against the Nazis, the majority of the Vichy troops stationed in North Africa defected to the side of the Free French. By the time of the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the Free French forces had swelled to more than 300,000 regular troops. In charge of this troop train is 4F class number 4242 from Wellingborough Shed. As we saw earlier at Southwark Street Bridge, work to clear up and repair bomb-damaged sites could take months or even years. The Southern Railway's general offices at Waterloo Station were completely destroyed during an air raid on the evening of the 5th of January 1941. The remains of the offices were eventually demolished on the 11th of August 1942. Fortunately, upon the outbreak of war, the Southern Railway had evacuated its headquarters to Deepdene House near Dorking in Surrey. These shots were taken in May 1942 and show buses arriving at Deepdene bringing office staff to work. Pre-war used as a hotel, this elegant Palladian mansion had originally been built in the 1760s by Charles Howard, the 10th Duke of Norfolk. This is the interior of the Southern Railway's wartime general offices. 50 feet below, in the grounds at Deepdene, a bunker had been constructed which housed the site switchboard and traffic control centre. On the same day, the Southern Railway's film crew visited the nearby Dorking North Station, where a facility had been set up for the production of Edmondson cardboard railway tickets. The whole system, from printing and bulk storage to ticket racks dating and issue, dates back to 1840 and was named after its inventor, Thomas Edmondson, a trained cabinet maker who became a station master on the Newcastle and Carlisle Railway. The tickets in each series were individually numbered, and different colours and patterns helped distinguish the various types of tickets available. Following the introduction of compulsory conscription, the number of women employed on Britain's railways increased hugely during 1942 and 1943, reaching a peak of over 105,000. Women moved into all areas of the railway's operation except locomotive driving, which continued to be an all-male province.
This is a salute to women in war work. Women have taken up the reins in the public services, in industry and in the forces on a scale not only without precedent, but far exceeding everything that would have been thought possible before the present war. In the past 3 years, the women of Great Britain have set an inspiring example throughout the United Nations. They are up early and late in the public transport services. Arduous work in all weathers, such as taxes the strength of men in ordinary times. In many places, they drive buses as well as taking on conductor duty. Without them, millions of factory workers would be unable to be at the bench on time. From railway stations, not only the big ones in the cities, but particularly in the country, the mail porter has all but disappeared. So has the ticket collector. With complete confidence, girls have taken on the work. Even when it is unavoidably heavy work, they do it with a will and enable the train services to run on time and up to schedule. And remember that the war has made terrific demands on the railways, which we could not even attempt to meet if it were not for the women. Keeping locomotives in condition for the extra heavy war work is largely in the hands of women. It was once thought essentially a man's job, but the women are doing it as well as it was ever done.
They're all in good time for their war jobs at an LNER locomotive works somewhere in the north. Mrs. Simmons drives one of the 2 cranes that lift the 75-ton engine. It's just back to the repair shop after running thousands of miles, also on war work. In spite of the crane's great size, it needs very careful handling. The other crane driver, Mrs. Blackwell, is a grandmother, and she did similar work in the last war. 20-year-old Florence Salter was a press stamp operator in peacetime, and now she works a powerful drop stamp. It delivers a blow of 1 1/4 tons and stamps red-hot steel ingots into new parts for engines and wagons. A length of metal has been punched into a brake handle. Hilda Dixon, once a waitress, is a blonde and a furnace worker. Her job is to prepare the hot steel bars for sawing into sections. Mrs. Southall is an electric tube welder. She repairs on an average 300 boiler tubes in a 10.5-hour day. Pathé Pictorial pays high tribute to women railway workers.
This is Nine Elms Loco Depot, where railway women were filmed in December 1942 cleaning engine parts and assisting with the turning of Southern Railway Schools Class number 927 Clifton. Designed by Richard Maunsell, the fast and powerful Schools Class were the last locomotives in Britain to be built with a 440 wheel arrangement. 40 were built at Eastleigh Works between 1930 and 1935 and were all named after English public schools. Here, being thoroughly cleaned, is number 837, one of the Southern's S15 class. Best known for working heavy night express goods trains between Exeter, Southampton and Nine Elms, the S15s were also very capable passenger engines. Great Western Saint class number 2953 Titley Court is one of the locos seen in this sequence of loco cleaning filmed at a loco depot on the GWR. Women were employed in many jobs here in the heavy engineering shops at Swindon Works, doing skilled work previously done by the men such as coppersmiths, turners and welders. When Britain went to war, a previously forbidden job opportunity had opened up for women. their role shifting from domestic to masculine and dangerous jobs in the workforce made for important changes in workplace structure and society. Along with the railways, women went to work in the factories and joined the services, the Wrens, the WAFs and the ATS. Their previously conceived role of housewife was transformed into a patriotic duty, becoming the heroines of the home front.
At this station, near Chester on the LNER, the signals are manned not by men but by women. Doing her spell of duty is Miss Evelyn Arnold. She's responsible, with her relief signal woman, for over 40 goods and 30 passenger trains a day. And talking of angels, here is her relief, Miss Marjorie Causey. The two girls have been friends all their lives. They went to school together, and now they run the signal box together. Marjorie is on the second shift, and she signs on for the next 7 hours or so. Her friend on the first shift signs on at 5:15 in the morning. Pulling the levers needs muscle and the knack of pulling at the right moment. Besides working the levers, the signal woman must log each train and see that it has the right tail light. After receiving it from the box in the rear, she passes it on to the box ahead and must keep on the alert for any emergency.
In the heart of Hertfordshire, a country house has been turned into a school for teaching girls how to run railways, or at least railway stations, on the LNER. The school, fittingly enough, was the home of the late Sir Nigel Gresley, designer of locomotives, and the trainees are called commandos because everything depends on them, after a course lasting as many weeks as it used to take years. In the school's booking office, the girls learn how to find, date and deliver the right ticket in the right time. Married girls can hand out the singles as well as the single girls the many happy returns. And whether or not the passenger has to change, it's the change, the quick change, that matters.
And all stations to Whimsey, Yowick and Hay Noddy No. Blimey, it's a good train.
Our rolling stone of a cameraman finds himself at a North Country station that's manned entirely by a woman, if you know what I mean. To begin with, she's parcels clerk and porter. She thinks that bags on the truck are much better than bags under the eyes. She looks after the station log and deals with all inquiries, whether by telegraph or telephone.
A couple of rabbits that should have arrived yesterday. Right, I'll see. My goodness. Yes, they've arrived, all of them.
Mrs. Giddens is booking clerk, too. Ah, that's the ticket. And she's proved that her journey from her blitzed home in London was necessary. As station master, she's climbed to the top of the tree. Her only worry is where the station staff will go for their annual outing. A few miles from the station, we found a gang of women platelayers. They're making the beds. That is, making the sleeper beds ready for packing with ballast. It's their temporary way on the permanent way. And they're doing a tough job with a heavy spade and a light heart. Yes, it's heavy going, this plate laying after plate washing, but it's necessary work. The sort of work that helps to keep a vital service in action. Wherever sleepers in safer hands, these are the planks that take the chairs, that take the rails, that take the trains, that take the war workers to their war work. A different kind of fish plate from the ones they knew in peacetime. The chairs are fixed to the sleepers, and another good job's well and truly done.
Some people might think that our first mum, Mrs. Moore of Bishopstone, Sussex, lived above her station. She does, but that's because she's the station master. She's everything else too, from porter up. In fact, she runs the stations. Running a one-woman station is no easy job. Besides keeping the station clean, she keeps the books straight and presides over the booking office. That's the ticket. They say that her hand's got a permanent wave. Mrs. Station Master Moore welcomes every train and gives it a good send-off.
Wartime restrictions on restaurant cars added enormously to the number of people using the refreshment and dining rooms. Spread all over the railway company's network, the refreshment rooms had to be regularly supplied with food and drink from a central source. This is London Paddington, where supplies are being loaded by the women porters for delivery along the line. These are the busy scenes in the grand surroundings of the marbled columned refreshment room on Platform 1 at Paddington. Passengers to the West Country usually had to get refreshments at the start of their journey, as no facilities were available on the train. After the long journey from Paddington to Exeter, where there was a short stop, passengers crowd into the refreshment room for some sustenance before continuing their journey. Filmed on the 4th of January 1943 at Eastleigh Works, these are the first of a batch of LMS 8F class locomotives built by the Southern Railway under a Railway Executive Committee order for 105 of these engines. One of the last of the Southern's 8Fs to be built, number 8681, was filmed on the 19th of January 1944 at London Charing Cross Station, with officials from the Southern and the LMS, along with Lord Leathers, the Minister of War Transport. On the outbreak of war, the LMS 8F had been chosen to become the country's standard freight design. The Southern built 23 of these at Eastleigh, another 68 at Brighton and 14 at Ashford. 8F production continued until 1943, when the cheaper War Department Austerity 280 was introduced. A total of 935 of the Austerity 280s were built between January 1943 and 1945. The chief designer was Robert Riddles, former assistant to William Stanier at the LMS. During the war, Riddles headed the Directorate of Transport Equipment. The engines were built by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow and the Vulcan Foundry in Newton-le-Willows. The WDs were designed to be cheap and easy to build and maintain, and to burn in different coal. Based on the LMS 8F class, various modifications were made to that design by Riddles, including a boiler of simpler construction which was parallel rather than tapered, and a round-top firebox, which was made of steel rather than the rarer and more expensive copper. Many parts were interchangeable with the 8Fs. Prior to the Normandy landings, the Army had very little use for these locomotives, so they were loaned to the Big Four railways. The Austerity 280s were produced at roughly twice the build speed of the 8Fs, and fully justified Riddle's confidence in both his design and constructional techniques. The prototype, numbered 7000, was filmed at the North British Works, the largest steam locomotive manufacturing company in Europe. At Euston Station on the 20th of July 1943, the Lord Mayor of London, Samuel Joseph, and LMS Chairman Thomas Royden are in attendance for the naming ceremony of newly completed, streamlined Coronation Class Pacific number 6245 City of London. Introduced in 1937, The outbreak of war had interrupted the construction of further members of the class. However, due to the dire shortage of express motive power, another 8 were built in 1943 and 44, the first of which was City of London. At the time, these locos were turned out, as seen here, in unlined black livery. The Southern Railway Film Unit was out and about recording more movements of Army tanks by train on the 9th of July 1943. The location is Charing near Ashford in Kent. These are Churchill tanks belonging to the 9th Royal Tank Regiment, 34th Tank Brigade. Formed in November 1940 and originally based in Otley in Yorkshire, they had been one of the first units to be equipped with Churchills. Between 1941 and 1944, the 9th Royal Tank Regiment moved around the country to Eastbourne, South Lancing, Charing, and eventually Aldershot. Along with this, the regiment's tanks and crews often travelled to various gunnery ranges, such as Bovington Camp in Dorset and Castlemartin in Wales. Filmed from the Southwestern Hotel overlooking Southampton Docks, the damage inflicted during the air raids of late 1940 is much in evidence. Completely destroyed in those raids was the Docks Telephone Exchange, originally located here in the basement of what was N Warehouse. Returning to the same spot in October 1943, the Southern Railway's new Docks Control Centre and Telephone Exchange had been rebuilt within the basement of the same warehouse, but was now covered with a domed structure made of 3 layers of 3-foot thick reinforced concrete with sand and quarry dust sandwiched between them, giving the roof a total thickness of 12 feet. As part of the build-up to the D-Day invasions, the US Army 14th Major Port Transportation Corps arrived at Southampton in July 1943 and took over the organisation of the docks. During the last half of 1943, the Americans supervised the discharge of approximately 350,000 tons of cargo at London, Southampton and Plymouth. Of that amount, over 162,000 tons were received at Southampton, which was later to become the principal US port on the south coast. This film, taken on the 16th of August 1943, shows American tanks and military vehicles being offloaded from ships following their sometimes perilous journey across the Atlantic. The track vehicles seen here with their transportation covers over the turrets are M10 tank destroyers. These were based on the chassis of the Sherman tank and were fitted with a 3-inch gun which fired an armour-piercing shot capable of penetrating 3 inches of armour at 1,000 yards. Also being unloaded at Southampton is an ammunition ship from America. The shells being loaded by hand into railway wagons for onward transportation. This is Axminster Station in Devon on the 3rd of October 1943, and the Southern Railway's cameraman was in attendance to film what is recorded on the log sheet from the time as the loading and dispatching of various types of tanks and military vehicles after trials. Standing in the bay platform at the far side of the station is the local train for Lyme Regis. Amongst the vehicles in this load, hauled by S-15 Class 460 number 827, are Crusader tanks behind the engine, and at the rear of the train, Valentine bridge layers. The conversion of these Valentine tanks was undertaken by the workshops of the Southern Railway. With the turret removed, they were adapted to carry a 30-foot scissors bridge. Hydraulic arms and rams were fitted on the tank for the launch and recovery of the bridge, the hydraulic equipment being fitted in the turret space. Another train departs from Axminster carrying 6 M4 Sherman tanks. The first Shermans destined for Britain had been produced in February 1942 at the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio. Under the Lend-Lease program, Britain received over 17,000 of these tanks. These are Lloyd carriers. Their mechanical components were based on those of the 1500-weight Fordson truck, from which it took the engine, gearbox and transmission. Some Bren gun carriers follow on behind. These Crusader anti-aircraft tanks had their turrets removed and were fitted with a 40mm Bofors gun, mounted in the fighting compartment behind a large 4-sided armoured shield. The anti-aircraft versions of the Crusader were developed to counter German tank-busting ground attack aircraft. Bringing up the rear are Churchill tanks. The first vehicle is hauling a rotor trailer containing extra fuel and ammunition. Another N-15 class, number 826, departs with the final train load. Another naming ceremony was filmed on the 23rd of October 1943, this time at London Euston Station. This was not for a new build, but for the renaming of LMS Jubilee class Malta. The George Cross had been awarded to the island by King George VI in April 1942 to recognise the heroism of its people during the great siege it underwent in the early parts of the war. Hence, the LMS took the opportunity to rename their locomotive Malta GC. At Leith in Scotland on the 25th of October 1943, 2,400 repatriated prisoners of war arrived back in Britain on board the liners Empress of Russia and Drottningholm. The men had been collected from the Swedish port of Gothenburg. A large number of the repatriated troops were sick or injured and would be dispersed around the country by train to many military hospitals and rehabilitation centres. At the same time, the first batch of repatriated German prisoners were arriving in Marseille. The following day, at Netley station on the outskirts of Southampton, crowds eagerly await the arrival of one of the hospital trains from Leith. Netley was home to the large Royal Victoria Military Hospital. Some of the returning servicemen had amputations of limbs whilst under the care of German doctors and were now able to have prosthetics fitted at Netley. During the war, the Southern Railways Works here at Lancing in West Sussex was kept busy repairing bomb-damaged carriages and wagons, and in converting carriages to mobile hospitals. The works were also involved in constructing Bailey bridges and the tailplanes for air-speed Horsa gliders for use in the D-Day invasion. As an obvious target for German bombers, the works, like many on the Southern, was given some added protection in the form of a 40mm quick-fire Bofors gun manned by the Lancing Works Home Guard. Pictured in this sequence are just some of the many items of military hardware that were produced by the workshops of the Southern Railway. At Eastleigh, work is well underway constructing 25-foot fast motorboats for the Navy. These wooden boats were made to a standard Admiralty design, which evolved from a series of craft built pre-war for the G-class destroyers. The woodworking skills of the craftsmen at Eastleigh were also put to good use in constructing these pontoons for floating bridges, which made great use of laminated plywood. Throughout the war, a number of different types of landing craft were used extensively by British and Commonwealth forces. These are the smaller assault landing craft, filmed being built at Eastleigh in September 1943. They were typically constructed of hardwood planking and selectively clad with armour plate. They could ferry an infantry platoon of 31 to shore at 7 knots. Shunting the loaded flat wagons around the works is loco number 230, a former LSWR-02 class 044 tank dating from 1892. These are the smaller LCPs, landing craft personnel, which were intended as assault craft but were also used for ferry work and ancillary services. Much larger and of steel construction were the LCMs, landing craft mechanized, which were designed to carry one medium tank of up to 30 tons directly onto a beach, or instead of a tank or other vehicle, they had the capacity to transport 60 troops. Hauling a completed landing craft out of the workshops is D1 class 042 tank number 232. Another type of wooden boat built in the Southern's workshops at Eastleigh were these harbour launches, a general-purpose craft that could be used to carry up to 50 men or to transport stores. A completed launch is taken out of the workshops on the carriage transverser, which allowed the multiple entrances to the workshops to be accessed by a single track without the need for a number of points which could take up a much larger area. These are anti-aircraft rocket launchers, designed for use on defensively equipped merchant ships. The weapon consisted of a circular box inside which an aimer sat in the central seat. It was armed with 20 2-inch high-explosive rockets in racks, 10 rockets on each side. Amongst the other weaponry being produced by the Southern Railway were these barrels for 2-pounder anti-tank guns. Early in the war, the 2-pounder was used actively both as a main gun on tanks as well as mounted on a carriage. Though as tanks became sufficiently armoured to stand up to its shots, the 2-pounder was gradually replaced by larger weapons. The laying of new railway track and the maintenance and replacement of worn and damaged track had always been a heavily labour-intensive process. As more and more men were conscripted into the armed forces, the lack of suitable labour prompted the Southern Railway to experiment with this Lima 10-ton Caterpillar track crane. It was filmed in 1943, removing the permanent way from a disused line somewhere in the southeast. With the aid of the crane, the old sections of track are lifted in complete 30-foot lengths and loaded onto a train of flat wagons. These cranes were produced in America by the Lima Locomotive Works. The company had entered the construction equipment market in 1928 when it purchased the Ohio Power Shovel Company. The demolition of Slade's Bridge at Bookham in Surrey by the Southern Railway's Permanent Way engineers was filmed on the 19th of December 1943. The bridge had become unstable and was being demolished prior to its replacement. Two of the Southern steam cranes are seen in action in this sequence, numbers 1560 and 1561, delivered by Ransomes and Rapier in August 1940. Filmed on the 25th of November 1943 at Waterloo, the US Army Transportation Corps takes delivery of a converted 57-foot ambulance coach from the Southern Railway. The Transportation Corps had been tasked with procuring the specialized railway equipment required to move sick and wounded US Army personnel around the country. By the beginning of September 1943, 15 hospital trains had been made available to the Americans, each train consisting of 14 coaches converted from existing rolling stock at the Great Western Railway's Swindon Works. This coach is one of 3 self-contained ambulance unit cars designed to transport small groups of casualties. The closing section of this program features the US Army Transportation Corps' S-160 class locomotives. Almost 800 of these austerity-designed 260s were built between 1942 and 1943 and shipped to Britain. Loco number 2054 was filmed on freight duties at Christchurch in Hampshire on the 20th of May 1943. Although they were intended for use in Europe after the D-Day invasion, the first 400 to arrive in this country were put to work immediately by the War Department on Britain's railways. The Southern Railway's allocation of S-160s was just 6. The majority of the locomotives were deployed on the Great Western and on the LNER. More of the S-160s are seen at Eastleigh Works on the 10th of September 1943. These have recently arrived from America and are greased and oiled and thoroughly checked over before being put into traffic. The S-160s had a very simple design in accordance with military requirements. Cheap, strong and reliable. The construction work was shared between Lima, Baldwin in Philadelphia and Alco in New York State. A second batch of another 400 of these engines was also shipped to Britain in the immediate run-up to D-Day. These were prepared for storage by US ATC personnel, ready for use on mainland Europe after the invasion. One of the Southern's allocation of S-160s was filmed passing through Salisbury Station with a goods train on the 7th of December 1943. The story of Britain's railways at war continues in Part 3, with them once again coming under attack from German aircraft and flying bombs. The railways would also play a huge role in the Allied invasion of Normandy, which would lead to the defeat of the German forces and victory in Europe.